The first step is to download your pattern. Select your file according to your paper format and the size you wish to make. Print your pattern at 100% scale. There is a scale test included on the first page of your pattern to ensure you have printed correctly. Trim around the thin black borders and use clear sticky tape to piece the pages together. There is a layout included in the instruction guide to help you lay out all the pages correctly. Then cut around each individual pattern piece. Adhere a medium weight fusible interfacing to the wrong side of your main fabric if your main fabric is lightweight and you'd like to give your garment more structure. If your main fabric is particularly heavyweight, you may not need this, but in most cases, a medium weight fusible interfacing will help give your garment a better end result. Once your fusing is adhered to the main fabric, lay the pattern pieces onto the fabric. You can follow the cutting layout included in the instructions to make the most economical use of your fabric. Cut according to the individual instructions marked on each of the pieces. Pin the centre front pieces together with the right sides touching one another. Pin along the centre front straight edge. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. As an extra detail, I've decided to top stitch 3 mm from each side of each seam. This is an optional step, you can do it to add a little bit more interest to your garment. Pin the middle front pieces to the centre front piece, matching the notches together. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side. If you are adding the optional top stitching, go ahead and do so now as well. Pin the side front piece to the middle front piece, matching the notches together. Stitch using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side of the bodice and add the optional top stitch if you are doing so. Now the front of the bodice will be completely together. Pin the back piece to the front pieces at the side seam, matching the notches. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Add your top stitch if you're doing so. Repeat all of these steps for your lining pieces. If you've been adding your top stitch, there's no need to do that for your lining pieces. Turn your lining over so that you are looking at the wrong side. Place a piece of rigoline or sew-in boning on top of the seam allowance. Cut the boning to ensure that it finishes 1 cm or 3/8 inch above and below the edge of the seam. Pin it in place along the seam. Use a sewing machine to stitch the boning onto the seam allowance. Repeat this for the front bodice seams, excluding the centre front seam. You will also add it to the side seam. Now we will be using our trim piece. You can use any strong trim, cord or ribbon-like material for this. However, I have cut 25 mm or 1 inch strips of my main fabric on the bias, folded it in half, stitched along the edge and then used a loop turner to pull it through to the right side. If you have extra fabric, you can use this method as well, but pre-purchased cord will work just fine. Cut 10 4 cm or 1.5 inch lengths of your trim. Fold one of your pieces of trim in half and pin it at the first notch to create a loop. The two cut ends of the trim should line up along the seam allowance. Continue creating loops at all 5 of the notches on one side, and then repeat for the other side of the centre back. Stitch along the loops 1 cm or 3/8 inch from the edge to secure the loops in place. Place the lining piece on top of the main piece with the right sides touching one another. Stitch all the way along the top edge, the side seams and the bottom edge using a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just leave a 3" or 7.5cm opening at the bottom, as we'll be using this to turn the garment through to the right side in the next step. Stitch around the outer edge using a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, don't forget to leave that opening. We will also be adding a piece of boning along the centre back edge on each side. Cut a piece that fits within the seam allowance, so that means it will be about 1cm or 3/8 inch shorter than the top and bottom edge. Stitch the boning onto the centre back seam on each side. Pull the garment through the small opening that was left. Take time and care here to ensure you don't distort the boning too much. Once you've got it all pulled through to the right side, press along the edges so that your bustier is nice and flat. Do not skip this step, it is very important. Use a hand sewing needle and thread to stitch the opening closed. Ensure you only pick up a few of the fabric threads at a time so the hand sewing stitch is completely invisible. Use the remainder of your trim and thread it through the loops. Start at the top and work your way down the corset to create a crisscross effect. Once that's done, you're all done.